A Japanese landing at the mouth of the Gulf or closer to the oil fields would have been viewed by Moscow almost without question as an intensely hostile act. One thing was crystal clear in 1939 and was later confirmed in several Pacific battlefields: the Imperial Japanese Army could not stand in open terrain in the face of modern firepower. A Japanese land unit, however formidable, in prepared positions would have been an easy lunch for a Red Army attack. There were also British forces in Syria and Palestine. In mid-1942, Japan was already feeling the pressure of a widened war-open conflict, with the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics at the end of an immense supply line was not something many Japanese planners wished for at that juncture. In the event after Imperial Japanese Navy adherents of the Ceylon Indian Ocean Drive made their proposition, the Army turned down the plan, claiming that a shortage of shipping prevented the dispatching of 2 divisions to Ceylon. As other historians have pointed out, the men and ships were in fact available for this offensive, so we are left in the dark concerning the Army's refusal to attack Ceylon. In all likelihood, its leaders were understandably growing apprehensive about overextension and could not see that the benefits of an attack on Ceylon, all hypothetical gains anyway, were worth the risk and the certain strain on the Japanese war machine. The second possible plan was an attack on the Hawaiian Islands. Not long after Pearl Harbor, many Japanese officers had realized that they might have missed a golden opportunity not only to paralyze the United States Pacific Fleet, but to seize Oahu itself. An attack on Oahu without the benefit of surprise would have required the services of at least 3 Imperial Japanese Army divisions. Considering the risks, the Imperial Japanese Navy did not formally make the proposal. However, naval planners also looked at an attack toward Hawaii without an initial attack on Oahu. The aim here would be the systematic conquest of the poorly defended outlying islands and, more importantly, to force a great Mahanian decisive battle against the carriers of the Pacific Fleet. All admirals believed in the ultimate importance of the decisive battle. They did not agree on timing. Many, for instance, wished it to be a counterattack to an American move into imperial waters. In any case, no one in Tokyo at this stage of the war had any appreciation of how rapidly the United States was reacting to the Pacific crisis. The Japanese assumed they had time to maneuver as they wished. In fact, however, the Allies were beginning to recover before Japanese conquests were complete in the Philippines and Burma. Nevertheless, Tokyo felt confident enough to delay the showdown with the United States Pacific Fleet until it had dealt with more immediately lucrative operations. The third possibility open to Japan in the eyes of some admirals was an invasion of Australia. A look at the map made it obvious that something had to be done about Australia. Unlike the conquered islands of the Pacific, it was home to an enemy population that was firmly at home in the modern world. Pre-war assessments had warned that Australia was an obvious base for a future Allied counterblow aimed at the East Indies. In addition, Australia was far from defenseless. 2 battle-tested divisions were heading back to the homeland from the Mid-East. In addition, a large militia force was being brought up to strength and furiously trained. Also, a move against southeastern Australia, where most of the population resided, entailed operations over very long distances. The Imperial Japanese Navy argued that 3 divisions positioned at strategic positions could paralyze Australia. More realistically, the Army estimated that 10 to 12 divisions would be required to seize the heart of Australia. Also, the Army could see the defensive advantage of controlling Australia. It could also see that it would be a valuable addition to the empire. However, the Imperial Japanese Navy was asking the Imperial Japanese Army to gut the Kwantung Army in Manchuria and deploy a high percentage of Japan's merchant marine to a battle that might prove difficult. Many admirals likewise had doubts about attacking Australia proper. Regardless, the Army slammed the door on the proposal, as well as more modest plans to attack Brisbane and Queensland. To repeat, we should not view these strategic disagreements as simply between the Japanese Army and Navy. Indeed, had the Imperial Japanese Navy spoken with one voice, the possibility existed that the Imperial Japanese Army might have gone along. Yet the Army had proven very good at saying no and very bad at presenting alternatives, because the Army had thwarted so many different plans. Many in the Imperial Japanese Navy were in. Since the frustration in March 1942 was vividly expressed by Captain Yashitake. Miwa, a young staff officer at Combined Fleet, who was favored by Yamamoto. We want to invade Ceylon. We are not allowed to. We want to invade Australia. We cannot. We want to attack Hawaii. We cannot do that either all, because the army will not agree to release the necessary forces, though it is understandable that the army has to retain troops to deal with the Soviet Union. Is it that impossible to spare us just 1 or 2 divisions out of 1 million men in Manua and 400,000 in China in defense of Imperial Japanese Army leaders? They had good reason to refuse all of the Imperial Japanese Navy plans just described. Furthermore, the plan ultimately accepted by the Army would have aided Japan's war effort greatly had it succeeded. The Army's great mistake was not in strategic direction, but in timing. Had Army leaders shown more foresight in the initial planning stage and coordinated operations more clearly with the Navy, it is almost certain that Japan could have secured the entire South Pacific for an indefinite period with the employment of only a very small force. The story of this missed opportunity is complex and does not follow a simple chronology. The expedition to Rabaul, although developed in the advanced planning stage, was not a major aim of the Imperial Japanese Navy, and certainly not a place where the Japanese Army wished to write a blank check. General war planning for a conflict between Japan and the Allies had been pending among Japanese leaders for years, likewise true for the Allies. However, operational plans, those to be converted into reality, appeared quite late in the game. September and November 1941 were the key months inside Japanese headquarters for developing the plans that were intended to conquer a great empire in a very short time. It was during this period, for instance, that Tokyo yielded to Yamamoto and approved the attack on Pearl Harbor. The Army was cool to the Rabaul expedition and even less enthusiastic toward any plans made to expand RAB's position. Pre-war planners were, however, already confronting the Australia question. Shortly before the war, Army and Navy planners made a list of possible Allied options. Once war had begun, all hoped that the Allies would do what the Japanese wanted: move towards Southeast Asia and the Philippines and accept a large naval battle. But simple prudence required appreciation of the situation if the Allies followed a different path. As is often the case in contingency planning, Imperial officers were given one option that had an uncanny fit to events as they transpired. In the event that the United States and Great Britain elected to avoid decisive battle early in the war, they would probably limit themselves for the time being to submarine and air attacks on Japanese supply lines. At the same time, they would endeavor to secure their communication lines with Australia and India with a view to the eventual use of these territories as bases for the start of a counteroffensive, as events were to prove. These were hardly idle fears. Japan's southern position collapsed from Australian bases, and its western flank disintegrated later when attacked from India. The above was a joint Army-Navy assessment of the coming war. The report sanctified an Army expedition to Rabaul, yet the Army was extremely conservative when it allocated manpower. The force allocated to seize Rabaul and its vicinity was a reinforced infantry Regiment 144th Regiment of the 55th Division, the South Seas Detachment under General Horry, and some naval garrison units, because Rabaul was not considered a top priority. South Seas Detachment was ordered to capture Guam first, which it did in a few hours on December 10, 1941, in an odd contradiction of strategic terms. The Imperial High Command feared that South Seas Detachment might encounter serious resistance at Rabaul, given the position's obvious importance to Australia. In early January, a dozen long-range bombers began periodic attacks on the weak Australian air units on Rabaul, quickly neutralizing them once it was realized that local commanders also wished to seize nearby positions in New Guinea. The long-range attacks were then directed toward Lu and Salawa in New Guinea. Both essentially undefended. Japanese intelligence analysts correctly anticipated meeting 1,500 badly equipped Australian troops on Rabaul. They believed also correctly that South Seas Detachment could make quick work of them. However, there did exist the possibility of an admiral's worst nightmare: enemy surface ships getting within firing range of troop transports. This had taken place once at Balikpapan on Java a few weeks before, when an American squadron of ancient destroyers had sneaked into a harbor and torpedoed several troop ships, one of the few setbacks suffered by Imperial forces. In the early stage of the conflict, naval intelligence believed there were several Allied cruisers in southern Australian waters. They also feared the possibility of the unexpected appearance of a United States aircraft carrier. Consequently, South Sea Detach MPRI from the clutches of Japan's army with the pliers was given lavish support at exactly the wrong time. When the transports carrying General H's men left Krakatoa in mid-January, they were soon covered by much of combined fleet. The covering force included no less than 4 fleet aircraft carriers, 2 battleships, and several cruisers and destroyers, more surface ships than available in the Pacific by the combined Allied navies. In January 1942, the huge fleet was certainly not required to prevail over the small ground force on Rabaul and its insignificant air contingent. Considering the weakness of any possible opposition, one wonders if combined fleet was already concerned about attack from the United States carriers that they had lost track of, or perhaps feared the still untried attacks of land-based medium and heavy bombers on transports in northern Australia. There were already a handful of American B-7 flying fortresses. There were a larger number of Australian Hudsons of very poor bomber under the best of circumstances based in Rabaul, Port Moresby, and northern Australia. The numbers of aircraft involved were small indeed. Fewer than 20 Allied bombers could take to the air if luck was on their side. The surface fleet, feared by Japan, existed and would play a great role in events in early May. However, at the moment, South Seas Detachment was as safe as naval power could make it. Nearly 100 carrier-based aircraft attacked Rabaul prior to landing. To finish off what was left of the Australian defenders, Japanese ground forces, possessing a heavy superiority in numbers, lavish air support, and the support of fire from warships, made quick work of the job and secured Rabaul in 2 days. The heavy support was unnecessary at the moment. No Allied cruisers sorted. No Australian aircraft proved a threat. 1/3 of the covering force would have been more than adequate after victory. The bulk of the covering force returned for other duties. 1 naval unit remained at Rabaul, the Japanese 4th Fleet, under the command of the brilliant Shoshiro Inoue. Between October 1940 and August 1941, Inoue was chief of the Naval Aviation Department and a close friend of Yamamoto. More than any leading Japanese admiral, Inoue was what Americans would have termed air-minded. Although Yamamoto and his young staff had great faith in the aircraft carriers, the head of combined fleet still retained great faith in the power of battleships. Inoue denounced the Japanese gun club, to use another American term, as a dangerous anachronism. Air power, Inoue argued, would dominate naval warfare. In addition, Inoue had nothing but scorn for those militarists who dismissed America's will to fight, knowing the industrial potential of the United States. Inoue had been a strong opponent of the Axis and argued against war. Although threatened with assassination by nationalist hotheads, Inoue was never one to hide his opinions. Only his outstanding credentials and distinguished service allowed Inoue to continue in a responsible position. After his stint on staff, Inoue was given combat command as head of 4th Fleet, based in True, sometimes called the Mandates Fleet. It was designed to patrol territories long held by Japan. It was also the least powerful Japanese fleet, based upon 3 light cruisers, 2 M-sweepers, and a squadron of destroyers. The main task given 4th Fleet was the close escort of South Seas Detachment to Rabaul. After the powerful elements of combined fleet left Tokyo, decided to station 4th Fleet at Rabaul. The fact that the smallest of Japan's fleets was sent to Rabaul with the smallest of its attack forces is indicative of the initially low priority given this part of the overall offensive. Yet events throughout the Pacific had proceeded better than anyone in Tokyo had a right to expect. Consequently, well before 4th Fleet left TRO, Imperial Japanese Navy leaders were already beginning to think in more aggressive terms concerning possible action in the New Britain area. Strongly encouraged by Inoue, naval planners proposed that as soon as practical, South Seas Detachment and 4th Fleet should add depth to the base at Rabaul by seizing the little Australian seaplane base at Taiji, a small anchorage a few miles from the then unknown island of Guadalcanal in the Solomons. In addition, the Japanese would seize the rough civilian airstrips at Lae and Salawa, just west of New Britain on the coast of New Guinea, as soon as a small number of Zeros could operate from L and provide some air support against the tiny, but slowly growing Allied air contingent in northern Australia. 4th Fleet would embark for Port Moresby on the southeastern coast of New Guinea, just west of Lae. With Moresby and Lae in Japan's pocket, all of New Guinea would have been in Imperial hands. The defensive and offensive implications are indicated by a strategic appreciation that accompanied the orders to increase the perimeter in late January. First acquisition of air bases in the Solomons and Papua areas would vitally strengthen Japan's strategic position, giving the Navy the advantage of expanded aerial reconnaissance over waters in which enemy naval forces must maneuver. For a counter-offensive from the southeast, seizure of such bases would deprive the Allies of key positions for a counterattack, and could be effected at the cost of committing a relatively small number of troops. 3. Japanese control over these areas would intensify pressure on northeastern Australia and hinder its use as a base of Allied, particularly air operations. Unstated was the obvious conclusion that holding all of New Guinea, the Bismarck, and the Solomons would be a tremendous advantage if Tokyo decided to turn its efforts toward either a direct attack on Australia or a more likely attempt to cut it off from United States support. A few weeks later, opponents of the Midway operation proposed that operations toward the Australian lines of communication with the United States were a superior alternative. Midway opponents argued that the biggest danger of the operation was that the United States Pacific Fleet would decline battle and cede Midway. Midway, some Japanese planners argued, was of dubious strategic value and would constitute a serious drain on shipping required to supply the garrison in defense of the operations deep into the South Pacific. Yamamoto's opponents contended that the United States fleet would fight to keep Australia an active part of the Allied war effort. If the United States fleet did not fight, then Japan would possess objectives of great value worth the drain on shipping and supplies. Yamamoto's prestige was far too great for opposition to prevail in addition. Yamamoto promised the Army and his opponents in the Navy that after he gained a great victory over the Pacific Fleet, his warships would join with a large concentration of transports gathering in True and move into the South Pacific in the summer of 1942. With the clarity of hindsight, we can see that Yamamoto's critics had a very strong argument. There was little subtlety in Yamamoto's operation with Japan confining operations to one small target, the task of the United States Pacific Fleet. Forewarned by the code breakers, was greatly simplified. How events would have played out in the much broader expanse of the South Pacific is an intriguing question. It is hard to imagine how things could have turned out worse for Japan in light of the events at Midway. At this juncture, combined fleet engaged in 2 carrier raids that inflicted short-term damage to the reeling Allies in the long run. However, this proved to be a strategic error of the first magnitude. The first, on February 19th, was a 4-carrier raid on the small and rudimentary Australian port of Darwin on the northern coast. The Japanese made this attack to secure the eastern flank of ongoing actions against Java. The 180 aircraft involved leveled Darwin but achieved little of value. There was nothing at Darwin capable of hindering Japanese actions in Java in any way. Quite the contrary, the Allies were abandoning Java. Any men or material that had embarked to the Indies would have ended up in Japanese hands. As it proved, Japanese land-based aircraft and surface warships had more than enough strength to finish off Allied air and naval forces in the area. When done with, Darwin combined fleet's carriers rushed to refit for another raid into the Indian Ocean. While the Japanese were sailing away from Darwin, a small United States task force, based upon the fleet carrier United States ship Lexington, under the command of Vice Admiral Wilson Brown, was heading toward Rabaul to make a raid of its own in the early weeks of the war. Unable to engage Japanese forces in serious battle, Admiral Chester Nimitz, new head of Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor, authorized a series of Itandran raids by America's 3 fleet carriers. Then in the Pacific, Lexington Enterprise and Yorktown, a Japanese submarine, torpedoed United States ship Saratoga near Pearl Harbor and damaged it. Combined fleet counted it as sunk. United States ship Hornet had not yet arrived in Hawaiian waters, although it soon did so in most dramatic fashion. United States ship WASP spent the first few months of the war aiding the British defense of Malta. Americans employed a small number of light escort carriers to ferry aircraft, but they were not expected to fight Nimitz, hoped that such tactics would unsettle the Japanese, make them cautious, and slow them down indeed. For a short time, Combined Fleet dispatched 2 Japanese fleet carriers to guard the approaches to the home islands, yet the policy had its critics, sending United States carriers within launch range of Japanese bases had inherent risks from air attacks and submarines. United States admirals did not anticipate inflicting major blows against Combined Fleet, but nevertheless risked precious assets. Luck was kind to Nimitz, and no United States car-bearer suffered any damage. Indeed, although no one knew it at the time, Admiral Brown did the Allied crews a tremendous service. The first Lexington raid was not in an operational sense a great success. When approaching Rabaul on February 20th, Lexington was sighted by a long-range Japanese seaplane. The Lexington was outside of even the prodigious range of the Zero. There was no timidity among Japanese officers still flush with victory, and they immediately launched attack on the Lexington by 17 new Betty bombers, their entire long-range strike force of 24th Air Flotilla, sometimes called 11th Air Fleet, newly established at Rabaul. Fortunately for the Americans, the torpedoes, which made the Betty so deadly against British surface ships early in the war, had not yet arrived. So the Japanese loaded bombs. Instead, it may have made no difference. American radar picked up the raiders, and Lexington's Wildcat fighters made an accurate intercept in the air battle that followed. The Japanese suffered one of their worst tactical reverses of the early Pacific War, as confirmed by post-war Japanese records. Wildcats shot down 15 of the bombers at the cost of 2 defenders. Lexington was never in serious danger. The Americans proved they could risk an engagement inside the air perimeter of a major Japanese base. They had also shown that Japanese bombers, whatever their other virtues, were extremely flimsy, a flaw that would cost Japanese airmen dearly. One can only imagine the reaction at Combined Fleet when the news arrived. Its leaders, knowing that 4 of their carriers were at sea some 1,200 m east, had Combined Fleet divided its carrier task force and covered the operations planned out of Rabaul. It would have had ample aircraft to demolish Darwin, and might well have caught Lexington, Port Moresby, and Tulagi. Both would have fallen almost certainly in weeks. Infuriated Inu called for replacement aircraft to be flown, and while waiting to re-equip his shattered bomber force, Inu also delayed the invasion of Leh and Salawa from March 3rd to March 8th under normal circumstances. 5 days is not a long postponement in this case. However, the situation could not have worked out worse for the Japanese. The Lexington Task Force joined up with United States ship Yorktown, and Nimitz granted Will's request to strike Rabaul again. While the task force was sailing toward Rabaul, Allied reconnaissance picked up the Japanese transports and escorts embarking from Rabaul toward Leh and Salawa. Wilson immediately saw that hitting a landing in progress offered the opportunity to rattle the Japanese seriously. The Japanese put their troops ashore on March 9th and swept away the insignificant opposition. The next day they received a shock. Wilson's task force, for reasons of safety, maneuvered toward Port Moresby and launched from the west of Leh. This required the 100 American aircraft to cross the Owen Stanley Mountains, but this potentially perilous operation was carried out without loss. The surprise was complete in the raid that followed. United States aircraft attacked the transports and their escorts and lost only a single plane within hours. A strike of 8 United States B-7s also joined the attack. Had the carrier pilots been more experienced, no doubt the Japanese losses would have been worse. As it stood, Inu's force was rudely treated. American planes sunk a minesweeper, a merchant cruiser, and a transport, and damaged a light cruiser and 2 destroyers. Although not crushing, 4th Fleet's losses were serious enough to cause postponement of the planned move on Port Moresby and Tulagi in March. Port Moresby was nearly undefended, and Zeros based at Leh could have easily dealt with any Australian and American air defenders. Yet the possibility of United States carriers in the area and the painful realization that the Allied buildup in northern Australia was taking place much faster than anticipated altered the equation. A Japanese invasion Fleet going from Rabaul or Lu to Port Moresby had to steam uncomfortably close to Australia prior to Admiral Brown's raid. Inu and Tokyo believed that Fourth Fleet could handle things by themselves after the raid. However, the transports appeared much more vulnerable. An expedition without air protection from combined fleet's carriers was judged too risky, unfortunately, for Tokyo combined fleet at a moment when the Allies were still desperately weak, had embarked on a major carrier raid against Ceylon on April 9, 1942. The Ceylon raid was another illustrious tactical victory. However, by the time Nagumo's carriers had returned to imperial waters, the ED positions in the Indies, the Philippines, and Burma were obviously hopeless. However, this meant that Tokyo could no longer put off a final decision concerning where next to concentrate the action. Tokyo had squandered an opportunity to grab Port Moresby on the cheap, although no one on either side of the Pacific could have anticipated it. The Japanese juggernaut had reached high tide within weeks. The slow slide toward defeat began. One individual who did not participate in further events was Wilson Brown, relieved because of failing health. Many fine historians have covered in detail the rapidly moving and critical events of mid-April through early June 1942, because they deal with the realm of naval grand strategy. One shall not address them in any length. With the return of combined fleet strike force from Ceylon, Yamamoto began pressing for the Midway operation. When the Diddle raid struck Japan, opposition to the Midway attack faded quickly, yet the army was growing more concerned with Australia. Consequently, combined fleet detached 2 fleet carriers, 1 light carrier, and several other warships to escort a troop convoy to Port Moresby. Inouye, the strongest advocate of a move against Port Moresby and the Australian supply lines, was overall commander at Rabaul. The Japanese also dispatched a much smaller expedition to Taiji in the Lower Solomons. The Japanese expected that the Allies would fight for Port Mose, and they were right. Nimitz dispatched a task force based on the Lexington and Yorktown to the South Pacific, where it would meet up with a force of Australian and American cruisers and destroyers. Although Tokyo did not know it, Nimitz based his decision partially on intelligence gained from his now famous code breakers. The confused Battle of the Coral Sea raged on the seas during May 5th to 8th. After raiding the small Japanese force on Tulagi, the United States carriers attacked the invasion fleet support forces, sinking a light carrier. The next day, the fleet carriers engaged the Japanese sunk Lexington and damaged Yorktown. American raiders damaged Shokaku and badly mangled sister ship Zuikaku. Air Group students of the battle have argued for 50 years over lost opportunities for purposes of our story. The most important result was that Inu, lacking adequate air cover, recalled the MSBY invasion fleet and postponed the attack until early July. Inoue never received another opportunity for an attack on Port Moresby. Yamamoto's gamble at Midway ended in catastrophic failure. At True, the Imperial Army and Navy assembled a sizable force of transports and warships and troops intended to strike at New Caledonia, the Fiji, and Samoa. When news of Midway slowly filtered throughout the Japanese military, combined fleet postponed the great offensive into the South Pacific. Although the Allied counterattacks at Guadalcanal and Bua were months off, neither would have been possible without combined fleet's bitter defeats in the summer of 1942. Some historians have argued that Japan's failure to capture Port Moresby and become well established in the Lower Solomons was irrelevant, because the entire war evolved around the outcome of carrier battles, island bases. So goes the argument proved ineffective when one side or the other possessed carrier super superiority, although championed by fine analysts such as H.P. Wilmot. This retrospective assessment of the overall situation is erroneous. In the first place, although United States carrier fighters had made short work of one raid on April 20th, the Japanese had not proven that their carriers could effectively engage an alert and well-armed Allied airbase, as events of 1943 would show. Dramatically, Allied land bases were far too powerful to attack with Japanese carriers after Midway had cut their numbers, and the Battle of Santa Cruz in October 1942 had damaged their remaining air groups to a large degree. This reflected the tremendous errors made in Japanese warplane designs, which showed up most quickly in carrier engagements. More significantly, the carriers proved their tremendous potential in a series of engagements in 1942. Consequently, their targets were each other outside of Pearl Harbor. Very little damage was done by either sides. Carriers accept the destruction and damage wrought on other carriers. The result was a kind of suicide pack-a-bye. The end of 1942, both Japan and the United States had skeleton carrier forces left. However, both sides were so weak that for nearly a year carriers had little active impact on the air war in the South Pacific. In addition, a far more important factor was at work that could hardly be appreciated by Tokyo. Although the United States had resigned itself to losing the Philippine Islands, Guam, and Wake, there was nothing in the book of plans concerning Australia. It was true, as Japanese admirals like Inu had feared, that Australia was an obvious line of advance for an Allied counterattack into the Indies. It is also true that there was tremendous pressure inside Washington to move the maximum amount of resources possible to Europe or the invasion of North Africa. For months, General of the Army George Marshall and his supporters did battle with Admiral Ernest J. King and MacArthur over the allocation of American resources in the first year of the war. Ironically, despite 2 years of planning that assumed a United States offensive in the Pacific would only begin when the new ships began to appear in late 1943, and that the attack's axis would be across the Central Pacific. The United States made its first major commitment of forces in World War II to Australia, never seriously contemplated as a battlefield. Australia, as we shall see, was also linked to the loss of the Philippines when the Japanese seized Rabaul, bringing great urgency to CRA's decision to recall 2 veteran Australian divisions from Europe and encouraging the United States Navy and Marines to make commitments at places never heard of prior to Pearl Harbor. They opened a theater that the United States had never seriously considered prior to the war. The nexus of the war in 1942 lay on the decks of the carriers only as long as one side could obtain a decisive advantage. Considering the balance of carrier forces during this period, the result was stalemate. In this environment, land bases grew tremendously in importance. Wilmot describes Rabaul as irrelevant. It is true that ultimately Rabaul could not protect the southern flank of the empire. However, its presence forced the Allies to wage 2 separate campaigns lasting more than a year and a half to crack the Rabaul position. Hardly an irrelevant course of events. Instead, it is clear in retrospect that Tokyo bungled badly by not taking MBY in early 1942, when the operation would have been so easy without MBY, particularly if Japanese moves into the South Pacific had forced reinforcement shipping far to the south. It is likely that Marshall and his supporters would have simply closed down the Southwest Pacific Theater completely. Air units based in northern Australia could only launch long-range attacks with little benefit and serve as reconnaissance. It was unacceptable and repugnant for the United States to allow Australia to follow the same road as Baton and Singapore. However, if the Japanese had seen the connection between politics and strategy, they could have made moves meant to make Australia an unproductive offensive base without mounting attacks that appeared to threaten Australia itself. Had Tokyo done so, Japan might well have shut down the Southwest and South Pacific theaters before they began. Certainly, keeping Allied forces off of New Guinea would have made Washington and Canberra face a very hard decision if the Allies wished to engage in the long and costly crawl up the coast of New Guinea. They would be forced to either recapture Morby or seize the Solomons unless they were able to gather the resources to do both. In 1942, an almost impossible scenario, the rationale for launching an offensive from the South Pacific itself would have naturally come into question as United States forces grew in the Central Pacific in 1943. In short, had the Japanese seized Tulagi and Morby early in the war, there is good reason to believe that the large United States buildup that took place in both theaters would have been postponed indefinitely. If Australia were considered safe, the United States might well have concentrated on building its position in Hawaiian waters in preparation for Central Pacific offensive and moving more men and equipment to Europe. If the Allies feared for the basic security of Australia, it was very likely that they would have deployed defensively. They might well have tried to keep heavy bomber bases in operation in the northern sector of the country, but United States ground forces would have most likely been deployed south of Brisbane until the Allies could increase their strength. It is also very possible that the large force rushed to the Pacific by President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the first weeks of war might well have been directed to Europe if a secure defensive Japanese position had been established. Had the Allies been required to fight a major battle against a solid land air base just to begin a long campaign, the strong advocates of alternate strategies would have probably won the day. At minimum, a Japanese seizure of Morbi would have slowed an Allied offensive in New Guinea by months. As it was, Japan suffered from the worst of two worlds. MacArthur came to Australia at the same time that the crack Australian Infantry Division arrived from Europe. Rapidly, forces moved into Morbi, and indeed the Australian Army had their first victory over Japan when South Seas Detachment left the comfort of Rabble to a horrid destiny in New Guinea. This problem was made worse by another Japanese defeat at Mill Bay in September 1942. At the same time, Japan's easy seizure of Tulagi triggered the first great United States counteroffensive of the war, a move made more urgent when United States reconnaissance aircraft discovered Japanese pioneers slowly building an airfield on nearby Guadalcanal. All of these battles were unforeseen by the United States military. If Japan did not have the resources to take Morbi after Midway, it would have been far better not to have stirred the pot. Had the Japanese played their cards correctly, an excellent opportunity existed that the Americans would not have made a major theater in the South Pacific. Had the Americans not done so, the Japanese would have had the time they desperately wanted to rebuild their carrier air groups. They also would have had the time to greatly reinforce defenses in the Central Pacific. On one hand, their actions appeared to present serious threats, a situation that caused a vigorous Allied counter-response. On the other, the Japanese never really attempted to capitalize on their momentary strategic advantages in the South Pacific. Thus, Allied forces were drawn like flies to the theater, and ultimately the Japanese did nothing to keep their opponents from going over to the attack. The Allied effort was initially defensive in nature, but because they answered the early war's alarm bell with speed, it was inevitable that the Allies would go on the offensive. Japan should have secured the theater or left it alone in the long run. Japanese forces were drawn up and cooked like a chicken on a spit. The Port Morbi story was not over, however, and the next Japanese attempt to seize it accelerated an expansion of the war in the South Pacific and also led directly to the creation of Japan's second major base complex in the theater at WWII. Frustrated and furious at the failures at Coral Sea and Midway, the Japanese army decided to take Port Morbi with its own resources before the Allies built it into a major base of their own. Consequently, in July 1942, General Hori took South Seas Detachment from Rabaul to the coastal settlement of Bua south of Lee and began an audacious march over the Owen Stanley Mountains. Initially, the Japanese infantry displayed its superiority at jungle warfare, and H's men advanced steadily toward Mby. However, the time for such a move had passed. The battle-hardened Australian infantry back from Europe quickly reinforced Mosby and moved forward to meet the Japanese in September. An attempt by the Japanese Navy to support the advance by taking Mill Bay was thwarted by Australian forces, delivering Japan its first round defeat of the war. At the same time, Hori's drive had stalled outside Morbi. Without supplies and hope of reinforcement, Jer watched the Australians continue their build-up. Ominously, MacArthur dispatched United States 32 Division to positions south of Bua, threatening to cut off Hori. Worse still, the United States landing at Guadalcanal meant that both Army and Navy reinforcements would be sent to the Solomons. Afraid that the Allies would cut off Hari, Tokyo ordered a retreat. During the march back over the Owen Stanley, the Australians mauled South Sea Detachment badly. When the remnants returned to the Bua area, they joined entrenched Army and Navy service troops and suffered a murderous siege by Australian and American ground forces from November 1942 to January 1943. General Hori had been dead during the retreat to Bua. What remained of South SE Detachment perished in the Bua area. As the hideous fighting near Bua took place, the Japanese Army was also suffering defeat on Guadalcanal. In December, Imperial Headquarters decided to abandon Guadalcanal and that a realignment of forces was essential in the South Pacific. Thereafter, the garrisons in the Upper Solomons were greatly increased in size. However, The real shift came in New Guinea. Until the summer of 1942, the crude Japanese airbases at Lae and Salawa were lightly defended, when it dawned on the army that the impending fall of Bua gave MacArthur a straight road up the coast of New Guinea. It rushed to reinforce. Thousands of men were sent to the loose Salawa area as time went on. Tens of thousands more went to positions farther north. In December, the Japanese army occupied several new bases north of Le. Troops were sent to Finchhofen, Sittermadong, and above all Wewak. In January, they attempted a surprise offensive toward Wau, hoping to distract the Australian offensive, but they were stopped again. It proved to be one of the last offensives launched by the Imperial Army in the South Pacific as the Japanese buildup in New Guinea increased. Imperial headquarters decided that the Japanese Army Air Force should also receive major reinforcements. Planners always talked about stabilizing the situation and renewing the offensive in New Guinea. If they believed this, they were not watching the growth of Allied forces at the same time. However, with Japanese Army aircraft coming into the theater in large numbers, Madong became a medium-sized base. Pioneers built small 1200T fields in several locations up the New Guinea coast. The major effort, however, was made at Wewak on the New Guinea coast northwest of Lae. Wewak, like all base complexes, had several strips separated by a few miles, but Borum Dagwa and Wewak itself data on the Wewak complex are not as detailed as those on Rabaul. Wewak was under long-range Allied reconnaissance for months prior to its activation in August 1943, and one flight recorded the presence of 70 revetments at Wewak. Japanese aircraft were lighter and designed to operate on smaller fields than their American counterparts, so the fields were rarely large by American standards. One Australian report mentions that Wewak field was approximately 2,000 ft long, not much larger than some of the small Allied fighter and emergency strips that dotted New Guinea. The intelligence officer of a United States fighter squadron noted that all of Wewak fields were dirt and each lay on an east-west axis along a coastal plain. Unlike Rabaul, there was no naval contingent at Wewak, and initially there was no major garrison. Indeed, the idea of constructing Wewak and moving the Imperial Army's 4th Air Fleet there was to support Japanese divisions active in the field. In the spring of 1944, 2 of these divisions isolated from Japan garrisoned the General Vac area after 4th Air Fleet had been crushed until war's end. They waited for an air force that never returned. Instead, they reverted to a brutal semi-agrarian existence, all the while enduring small Australian bombing raids. At least half of the garrison, if one can call it that, perished of disease and starvation. Thus, unlike Rabaul, Wewak was no fortress. Nevertheless, in the summer of 1943, some 250 to 300 aircraft gathered at the Wewak strips. 4th Air Fleet was formed on Rabaul, but did not grow in numbers until moved to Vac. The Rabaul aircraft were met by reinforcements from Dutch New Guinea. On paper, 4th Air Fleet had just more than 500 planes in practice. However, Japanese squadrons in 1943 almost never matched their assigned strength. This was normally true with American units. Also, as befitted a defensive force, most were fighters or light bombers. However, all of the difficulties that hampered the creation of strong Japanese airbases were amplified at Wewak. The war was growing old by mid-1943, with Japan clearly losing shipping and skilled manpower were ever harder to procure. After the war, Colonel Inaka Kiko of 4th Air Fleet Supply Staff detailed the wasp that crippled Wewak and ultimately made it the scene of a smashing and lopsided Allied air victory. Up until April 1943, about 50% of aircraft on hand were in normal operation. Subsequent to that time, only about 25% of the total aircraft on hand were in full operation. This figure was even lower as the war progressed. In answering the obvious question of why operational readiness had declined so seriously, Kiko gave a revealing glimpse into the lack of depth that so harmed the Japanese war effort. The 2 main reasons were, first, poor maintenance, which was due to the poor equipment, and lack of maintenance personnel, which also resulted in high operational accident rates, and second, the lack of pilots. Due to ill ESS, there was a marked decline in the quality of engine parts and spare parts in general. Although we had an air depot, the Zur Mark had many operational accidents due to bad quality of spare parts during the period between May 1943 and April 1944 the losses were divided as follows. Result of aerial combat 30% destroyed on ground, 50% operational losses, 20% with the machinery and lab available. We were not able to provide an area large enough to disperse our planes and had to keep them all in a narrow confined area. Also low availability made it impossible to withdraw aircraft from threatened fields. After receipt of warning of a possible air attack, the result of these circumstances was calamity. I can remember occasions when entire flights failed to come back. The figure varies with operational conditions. For planning purposes, it was estimated that during big operations, 50% of the fighters, 40% of the bombers, and 20% of the transport planes would have to be replaced. However, due to low production and shipping and ferry losses, this plan was not followed, and consequently the New Guinea Air Force was destroyed from May 1943 until the Hollandia operation in April 1944. I would estimate a loss of 800 planes. The circumstances described by Colonel Ko are an excellent example of the catastrophe that awaited a Japanese garrison that lost its ability to receive substantial supplies. Fighter pilot Joel Paris of the United States 7 Event Squadron described the type of event that strangled WWII and many other Japanese bases. We hit a convoy off of WWII. In late 1943, I believe we were escorting B-24s hitting WWII, and we were up over 20,000 foot way out. I saw some ships on the horizon. Nobody said a word, and I thought I was the only one that saw them, but everybody had seen them and not said a thing on the radio to maintain security. When we got back, they started loading the bombers and picked up some extra B-25s for a quick return trip. It was a convoy laying out waiting for us to do our normal high noon raid and then coming behind us. And sure enough, when we got back there about 4 o'clock, and there was the convoy about 10 miles offshore, the B-25 started skip bombing these transports and sinking them right and left. The water was absolutely full of soldiers and sailors. They looked like corn flakes in milk. The B-25s and B-24s flew across the water, dropping 500 1,000-pound bombs into the water, eliminating the men swimming. We strafed them. To this was a resupply into WWII, and those supplies would be used to shoot us down. We did not give any quarter, and they did not either. The defects at WWII were worse than those at Rabaul, yet each revealed in different ways the shallowness of the Japanese industrial base. The same lack of technological balance crippled Japanese aircraft and harmed Tokyo's ability to create a mass of well-trained pilots. It is ironic that inferior bulldozers could cost an air force dearly, but that was exactly the case in the South Pacific. The fields at WWII, and no doubt many other bases, had too few taxiways, leading to too few revetments. When the order to scramble came, some aircraft could never clear the traffic jam. As soon as a few heavy American bombs disabled the runway, they were trapped. Add those victims to other aircraft that were grounded because of inferior parts, and the numbers of aircraft able to rise in battle declined. In turn, the aircraft that did make it airborne were increasingly outnumbered and at increasingly larger ratios. Obviously, this situation built combat losses. The result was enough to break combat effectiveness of the most intrepid units. Eventually, it became more important to keep a combat presence to prevent the enemy from moving on to more lucrative targets than to fight. That circumstance arose at Rabaul, which possessed far better facilities than WWII. Commander Tamayoshi Hori, assistant commander of Imperial Japanese Navy 75th Air Group on Rabaul, described what took place when the attacks became so powerful that defense was pointless. After the war, H was asked by American interrogators what was the policy of Japanese fighters at Rabaul when under attack toward the end of the Allied offensive in late 1943. Our fighters were usually too outnumbered to risk combat. When a raid was picked up by radar, all fighter aircraft would take off as a precaution. However, consumption of gasoline caused many of them to return to the field between raids or before a raid was over. Some of these fighters were destroyed on the various fields. Japan always held the smallest margin of error among the major combatants in World War II. Although the Allies took many false steps, they were able to recover, and what Japan required was more of everything useful to modern warfare. Unfortunately for Tokyo, the economy could not provide the needed punch in the face of such material weakness. The Japanese required a wise purposeful and well-coordinated military-political leadership able to assess the strengths and weaknesses not only of Japan but also its enemies. However, Tokyo lacked clarity of judgment. Poorly led and fundamentally weak Japan could only rely upon the often prodigious skills and great bravery of its servicemen to face an inherently stronger foe. It was not enough while the Japanese military ran in circles after the initial victories in the Pacific War. Their enemies were reacting with great speed and extraordinary determination to salvage a grim situation and turn the tables on Japan. Now it is time to look at the Allied side of the strategic equation. Most accounts of the Guadalcanal campaign note that the battle was fought at a time and place that neither side wanted. The observation is true enough. However, exactly the same can be said as to the entire American effort in the South Pacific. Although the Guadalcanal and Solomon campaigns both grew into major efforts and helped shred Japanese military power, no United States officer serving in 1940 would have dreamed in his worst nightmare a major campaign in the South Pacific. The possibility would have been less remote to an Australian, but the Aussies too were remarkably sanguine. I would like to make some general observations concerning America's strategic situation on the eve of Pearl Harbor. First, although this was painfully obvious at the moment, many accounts of the period do not fully emphasize how miserably prepared the United States military was for World War II. When considering the dreadful situation in Europe in 1941 and the obvious possibility of war with Japan, the government's rearmament plans in 1939, 1940, and 1941 were pitifully inadequate in every way. In addition, the basic strategic outline for the war, defeat Germany first, was already accepted policy. Washington intended that United States forces in the Pacific stand on the defensive and guard the Hawaii Panama strategic triangle. Indeed, until late fall 1941, United States planners were most concerned with the defense of the Western Hemisphere itself. It appeared virtually certain that the Soviet Union would collapse and that the United States and hopefully Britain would face Hitler's merciless attack alone. As we know now, these fears were well-founded. American weakness was very apparent. After Pearl Harbor in Washington, United States leader knew that the United States was desperately short of every military asset from infantrymen to battleships. Naturally, this triggered a serious debate over the allocation of finite resources that lasted in one way or another throughout the war. What is remarkable in retrospect is the ability of the American people, government and military, to react to a somber situation with great resolve and tremendous speed. Americans cut corners, rationalized procedures, shortened training schedules, and created a serviceable military. Within 9 months of Pearl Harbor, by mid-1943, the industrial floodgates were open, and an awesome war machine began to appear. It is not possible to explore the complex subject of United States industrial mobilization in this narrative, although its results ultimately dominated the struggle for the South Pacific. However, I believe it is important to recognize the tremendous importance of the rational command structure that was functioning before hostilities. American generals and admirals fought among each other as though they were on different sides of hostilities, displayed ego conflicts that ranged from childish to neurotic, and made mistakes in large numbers. Yet, unlike their Japanese opponents, United States military leaders operated in an environment where argument had purpose and policy was clearly articulated and flexible. Those involved were intensely partisan, but they argued their case on the merits and respected decisions that cut against individual judgments. If events necessitated a change in plans, then the plans would be changed, and the job done. I think in this regard the stability provided by Roosevelt and Marshall can hardly be overrated. By and large, the officers that came out of this environment proved to be good ones, accustomed to collaboration within their services. Americans proved very good at coalition warfare. This was of great importance because America's relationship with Australia and New Zealand was central to successful operations against Japan in the South Pacific, yet Allied supremacy was visible only later. On December 8, 1941, the situation in the Pacific appeared very bleak if the Allies worked under a fundamentally flawed assumption prior to war other than the safety of Pearl Harbor. It was overconfidence in British strength. It was true that many American and Australian officers realized that the British were badly overextended and would suffer defeat at the hands of Japan, but not even. Pessimists expected Japan to smash the British position in Southeast Asia and drive the Royal Navy into hiding in the Indian Ocean in less than 2 months. Instead, most American officers were looking at either Europe or the Philippines, the destruction of British power in the Pacific upon which Australia, in particular, had counted left an enormous vacuum. With London out of the picture, the vacuum could ultimately be filled only by either Japan or a combination of United States and Australian forces, assisted by New Zealand. As the events of early 1942 unfolded, 20 years of American strategic planning concerning the Pacific went into the trash, as the Philippines quickly yielded their central position to Australia in the allocation of American resources. The battle for the South Pacific, to the extent that the Americans had a role in determining its location, began as an offshoot of the Philippines campaign. Throughout the interwar period, the United States military had assumed that a war between the United States and Japan would take place on an axis between Pearl Harbor and Manila. Both sides created great battle fleets, preparing for a Pacific version of the Battle of Jutland, altering plans from year to year. When the war in Europe broke out and substantial United States naval resources were shifted to the Atlantic, the Europe First strategy was agreed upon. The United States Navy decided that the Philippines, Wake, and Guam could not be held. If war came, the United States Navy would wait for the new ships authorized by Congress and attack Japanese possessions in the Central Pacific. If the situation in Europe became desperate, most American resources would be shifted to the Atlantic, with the Pacific theater being put into deep freeze. This was rational strategy given the situation after the fall of France. One cannot dismiss the possibility that Hitler would have decided on a pause and that the United States would have moved against Japan. Some Japanese feared such an occurrence, but in 1941 few in Tokyo feared that a German victory in Europe would mean a Japanese defeat in the Pacific. However, giving up the Philippines proved more difficult in practice than in theory. United States General Douglas MacArthur, believing himself and the Philippines betrayed, promised an effective defense if he was given reinforcement, particularly aircraft. The United States government then began to practice a not very successful version of deterrence. President Roosevelt and some of his advisors believed that a buildup at Pearl Harbor and the Philippines might deter Japan from further aggression in the Pacific. If war could not be prevented, it might be delayed for a few precious months, thereby enabling the United States to strengthen its defenses. First, the fleet was moved from San Diego to Pearl Harbor. MacArthur received some reinforcements, although in his eyes they were not enough. Many admirals feared we were throwing good money after bad, yet the Philippines became a prime recipient of the pitifully small amounts of serviceable equipment available for combat. In 1941, had the United States determined to surrender the Philippines as war plans of 1941 assumed, MacArthur was badly informed. A matter of military do came strongly into play during the months leading up to the war. The United States Army Air Force had believed that its heavy B-17 bombers could serve as effective weapons to neutralize Japanese air power on Formosa and to attack a Japanese invasion fleet at sea. Considering the United States Navy's reluctance to charge toward the Philippines and the relative lack of expense of bombers, optimists in Manila and Washington put great faith in the power of the B-17 to deter a Japanese attack. As one War Department official put it, a large force centered on bombers in the Philippines would act as a threat to keep the Japanese in line. Thus, despite a desperate shortage of aircraft across the board in the late summer of 1941, the United States Army Air Force allocated 4 bombardment groups, or 272 aircraft and 130 fighters, to the Philippines. As events worked out, leaders were allocating aircraft that did not yet exist, and in reality only a tiny percentage of the promised force arrived. Considering the events of early December, this was no doubt a good thing. An obvious problem existed, however. If one was going to deter or fight Japan with modern bombers, how could Washington deploy the new planes as quickly as possible? Because of the great distances involved, and their small-size fighters had to go by ship. Unloaded bombers, however, could fly very far. United States Army Air Force leaders decided to fly their B-7s to the Philippines. However, there was no pioneered air route In this part of the Pacific, long-distance aviation was in its infancy. In 1941, Charles Lindbergh's flight was in 1927, and Amelia Earhart died in the South Pacific in 1937, and finding an obvious route from Hawaii to Manila was difficult. One thing was obvious: United States planes would have to cross over Japanese territory. In August 1941, under utmost secrecy, a delegation of United States Army Air Force officers toured Australian airbases at Rabaul, Port Moresby, and Darwin. All of these unknown and exotic places were soon to become all too familiar to United States airmen. On the morning of September 5, 1941, the first flight of B-7S to Manila departed Hawaii. The first stop was a reasonably short hop, the 1100 m2. Midway. Next was a similar run to Wake Island. Port Moresby was the next destination, but the route required United States aircraft to fly over Japanese-mandated territories in the Central Pacific. The B-7S took off at midnight, maintained total radio silence, flew at 27,000 feet through heavy rain, and finally arrived after a 200 m flight. The next run was a 900 m jaunt to Darwin. From there the bombers flew to their somber fate at Clarkfield near Manila. The United States Army Air Force had proven that Clarkfield could be reinforced by air shortly. It was obvious that this was a pointless achievement. The airmen had, however, helped precipitate the events that would bring Japan and the Allies into merciless combat in the South Pacific. Just months later, there were obvious military and diplomatic dangers to flying over a sovereign nation's airspace without permission. Therefore, another route swinging farther south had to be found. Actually, the idea was not new since 1940. Some in the United States Army Air Force had argued that the United States should develop a chain of fields across the South Pacific to take advantage of long-range aircraft. Until February 1941, the War Department turned down these requests on the grounds that the United States had no intention of moving long-range air units to the Far East, and that it would be folly to construct bases that might fall into enemy hands. This may have been a very wise decision had a well-developed complex existed in the South Pacific when war began. It is very likely that the Japanese would have moved on it quickly rather than chase phantoms near Ceylon and Darwin. By October, the War Department had reversed its policy and ordered a joint War Department-State Department effort to chart the appropriate routes, gain the necessary permission from foreign governments, and construct the bases required to supply the Philippines. The War Department ordered the Army Corps of Engineers to construct at least one 5,000-foot runway capable of handling B-7S on Christmas Island, Canton Island, Sua, in the Fiji, New Caledonia, and Townsville, Australia. By January 15, Washington ordered the Navy to improve Samoa and Palmyra Islands, while the United States was quickly becoming emaciated in distant waters. Another 2 flights of United States bombers were made over Japanese territory, bringing MacArthur's force of doomed B-7S to 35 in early November 1941. MacArthur ordered his Air Chief Lieutenant General Louis Britton to make a survey of the budding ferry route authorized by the War Department to spare little expense improving facilities. Britton did not like what he saw. Precious B-7S had been damaged during their earlier flights at both Darwin and Moresby, a wrecked flying fortress. Not the first lay at Bachelor Field near Darwin. Britton also noted that construction at Moresby was proceeding at a very slow pace, despite the approach of the rainy season. Nearby was Group Commodore William Goering, who later recalled Britton's visit prior to Pearl Harbor. There were no serious preparations to wage an air war in northern Australia or New Guinea. The first thing that happened of consequence was when General flew out from the Philippines and arrived in Darwin. I flew up to meet him. He told me, "Group Captain, I have $5 million in my pocket, and I want to find out where I can build aerodromes so we can bring squadrons from America through Australia and back into the pie." I said, "I can tell you exactly where to build them." I flew him down to Townsville, where we had a big conference that included Chief of the Air Staff Air Marshal Jones. The Americans agreed to pay for improvements at various drones like Marba in Queensland near Kay's Charters Towers. Port Moresby and a large complex near Townsville Mill Bay had not yet been considered. Britain did not want anything to do with Rabaul, and he was dead right there. A few months later, when we got a lot of earth-moving equipment out from the States, we really started building. Although Britain's ultimate mission had no chance of success, it emphasized the importance of Northern Australia. When war broke out, the Australians and Americans were already planning for the further development of Townsville, Darwin, and Morby. Thus, Britain's visit saved precious months in a conflict where air bases played a central role. The ability to construct and develop them was critical. Japan's rudimentary military construction capability proved a serious burden and crippled its forces during Guadalcanal. In contrast, the United States and its allies showed an impressive ability to organize major construction projects both quickly and efficiently. Although no one guessed it at the time, with the possible exception of Admiral Inu, the ability of the United States command to change its priorities overnight and implement a major base construction plan in an area where no one had previously thought to fight eventually brought Japan's position in the South Pacific to ruin. It is also ironic that much of this work was underway prior to Pearl Harbor. Japanese construction engineering based on a few light machines and much manual work, essentially unskilled local labor, was little more efficient than that done by General William Sherman's troops in the March to the Sea during the United States Civil War. As in so many areas, Japan had one foot squarely in the 19th century. The American effort was on a different level of sophistication prior to Pearl Harbor. United States efforts were based upon an old but proven relationship between the Army Corps of Engineer and private contractors. The Corps had its own construction battalions, and throughout the war increased them greatly in size. However, before the bombs began falling, they made use of well-established contractors, civilians, many of which had become closely linked with the military prior to hostilities. The advantage was obvious. United States civilian contractors had no unskilled local labor to call upon. By 1941, the Corps had officers who were fine managers and very competent engineers. Thus, Corps battalions were made up of men who had a very high level of technical skill because they had worked with many machines of every size. Unlike weaponry, which was in desperately short supply, companies that built construction machinery were among the first to benefit from the easing of the Great Depression. When rearmament began in 1940, the United States government was one of their best customers, as the military infrastructure in the United States had to be expanded tremendously to accommodate the millions of men who would be called to the colors. In addition, the Corps had a small but growing number of units that specialized in airfield construction. They employed heavy rollers, large earth movers, and specialized devices, not to mention officers who knew the trade well. In the early stage of the war, however, the standard engineer labor battalions carried most of the load. The problem was not lack of machinery, but rather the lack of shipping to get the machinery to the engine. Early in the war, valuable implements of all types collected in American, Australian, and South Pacific ports where they sat waiting for shipment to men working closer to the front. Many American engineers toiled hours under a hot sun with pick and shovel. However, even the most poorly equipped units had trucks, bulldozers, and other useful gear. Anything that could be used from the civilian economy in the area was quickly bought, leased, and requisitioned. In this regard, the Americans had an advantage over the Japanese. Several of the first bases were constructed in areas considered extremely underdeveloped by American terms, yet in many cases the rudiments of a modern economy existed, thereby allowing the Corps to exercise its skillful ability to innovate. On the other side, the Japanese found little to help them on Rabaul, and nothing whatsoever to aid efforts elsewhere in the South Pacific. The Allies also contributed greatly. The airbase that appeared almost by magic from the Japanese point of view were often the products of local enterprise. The New Zealand government not only provided engineers on Fiji, but also paid for a substantial improvement of island facilities through reverse lend-lease. The Free French government in New Caledonia gathered all the resources available and worked hard to complete the Tontuta airfield on New Caledonia and began work on a second. As one might expect, the Australians were able to render the most aid in response to the United States' request to Canberra in October 1941 to assist in constructing an air link to the Philippines. Australian engineers expanded civil fields at Rabaul, Morby, Darwin, and Townsville to handle a modest number of heavy bombers. Darwin, which suffered more than its share of warfare, remained primarily an Australian logistical responsibility throughout most of the war. The result spoke volumes. By December 28, 1941, a rudimentary route for B-7s across the South Pacific was ready. A small flight of bombers made the transit in early January. By the end of January, after several delays in construction, Christmas Island was opened and the theoretical link between Hawaii and Manila was ready, considering the lack of shipping chaos inherent in the period and magnitude of the task. This was a prodigious achievement. The construction of the ferry route to Australia proved to carry far greater strategic importance than General Marshall and his supporters in the Pentagon ever imagined. As the Japanese advance pushed forward with relentless force, Marshall's treasured Europe-first strategy came under serious attack. Fortunately for all concerned, Pearl Harbor ended forever any serious thought of trying to reinforce the Philippines. This was a bitter pill to swallow, and nobody in Washington quite gathered the courage to tell MacArthur bluntly that he was on his own. Indeed, in the weeks after Pearl Harbor, small and brave air and naval units attempted to supply forces in the outlying islands of the Philippines, but nothing could be done to help the major United States force at Baden. MacArthur bore a grudge against Marshall till his last breath, but there was no decision per se to abandon the Philippines. Only Roosevelt hoped something could be done, but the United States military saw that the situation was beyond repair. The Pentagon illustrates this realization most dramatically on December 9th, when it rerouted to Hawaii a large convoy of men and supplies bound for the Philippines that had sailed just prior to the Japanese attack. Remarkably, Roosevelt intervened and ordered the convoy sent to Australia instead of Hawaii, convinced that any possibility of taking pressure off MacArthur lay in directing United States resources into the South Pacific. Hawaii, the president decided, would be supplied from the mainland. Roosevelt's decision delighted the Australians. It also brought to a head a very obvious problem. If the United States was going to give up the effort to defend the Philippines, what was the purpose of the ferry route and proposed buildup in northern Australia? For a brief period, the United States and the other allies vainly attempted to protect the East Indies. Fortunately for the United States, the Japanese advance was so swift that it was not possible to send sizable air and ground units into the maelstrom of the so-called Malay Barrier. The United States Navy was not so lucky, and several brave ships went down in a vain battle against overwhelming odds. Yet, as previously noted, resistance to the Japanese ultimately paid tremendous strategic dividends. A more obvious answer arose. Australia itself, rather than the Philippines, would become the base of United States operations in the Pacific, until United States industrial might gain naval superiority. However, if Australia was to serve as a key to America's position in the Pacific, then Australia and the lines of communication must be protected. As late as Christmas Day 1941, Marshall had cabled Lieutenant General George Brett, commander of United States Air Forces in Australia, the purpose is to make your command predominantly air, with the other elements limited to those needed for efficient air operations and security of bases. He further warned Brett that there was no intention of transforming Australia into a second England. Nevertheless, within weeks, the United States ordered the deployment to Australia of the 41st and 32nd Infantry Divisions, an air force of 4 bomb groups, 4 fighter groups, a training group, and the most sophisticated ground facilities. That was only the beginning. Admiral King was convinced that Japan was going to strike into the South Pacific and break the communications chains so hastily constructed, and as of yet almost undefended. Consequently, 3 infantry regiments were ordered to New Caledonia and reformed as the Americall Division. Americans in New Caledonia, a Marine regiment, went to Fiji, where it was joined by the 37th Division. Several other small United States Army and Marine units took up garrison duties. In addition, the 27th Division went to Hawaii. In May, a serious argument developed between the American Army and Navy over the buildup in the South Pacific. The Army believed there would be enough warning to redeploy air and perhaps ground forces in case the Japanese moved. Consequently, it was folly, they argued, to heavily garrison every important island on the way to Australia. Roosevelt reaffirmed the Europe First commitment, and the Army managed to stop the flow of troops for the time being. Dwight Eisenhower, then on Marshall's staff, put the Army's case very nicely. The Navy wants to take all the islands in the Pacific, have them held by Army troops to become bases for Army pursuit and bombers. then the Navy will have a safe place to sail its vessels for its part. The Navy had serious doubts that there would be time to redeploy more fundamentally. King was convinced with reason that Japan was far from finished with its conquests, and that every Japanese victory made an ultimate Allied triumph in the Pacific. More distant and more costly, no more infantry divisions went to the Pacific for many months. However, Marshall could never underestimate the ability of Admiral King to gain additional equipment for the Pacific when the redoubtable MacArthur moved from the Philippines to Australia in April to take command of the newly created Southwest Pacific Theater. Another powerful voice was added in favor of reinforcing the Pacific. The Pacific Theater in the long run did remain a poor relation to Europe, however, despite all plans to the contrary. Prior to December 7th, the United States deployed more manpower to the Pacific Theater in 1942 than it did to Europe. This trend reversed dramatically in 1943, and compared to what Marshall would have liked to see, the Pacific continued to receive a larger percentage of United States resources than theoretically necessary. The Japanese had walked into a bear trap. When one adds 2 crack Australian infantry divisions to the balance, the Japanese army held a very small majority of forces in the Pacific Theater. The air gap in Japan's favor was larger, but closing weekly, it was absolutely essential that Japan keep the momentum going forward, and crucial that combined fleet maintain its qualitative and quantitative superiority for as long as possible, as we have seen Japan suffered a reverse in the Coral Sea and catastrophe at Midway, with combined fleet licking its wounds. The Allies scattered garrisons and air units, fearful until June 1942 that they would be attacked, could serve as an offensive force in an area where Japan was weak. Both King and MacArthur were quick to see that they did so. Furthermore, 2 of the humble ferry bases created for a hopeless campaign in the Philippines rapidly became elaborate rear complexes capable of sustaining offensive campaigns in the Solomons and New Guinea. 2 Allied base complexes were pivotal in crushing Japan in the South Pacific. Each served as a strategic terminal from which the forward combat bases could gain their strength to function. This was essential for the Allies because, unlike the Japanese, they lacked major supply bases in close proximity to their fighting airfields. Support for Rabaul came from the longtime Japanese base at TR Atoll, or Japan itself, the Japanese being able to take advantage of interior lines. Although the Allies had built airstrips with great speed during spring 1942, they still lacked a solid base of supply to sustain large-scale offensive or defensive operations. Pearl Harbor was much too far east to support a campaign in the South Pacific, and the developed portion of Australia was too far south. Needed desperately were major installations within bomber and transport range of the battle zone. These core bases required a suitable harbor, several good airfields, command facilities, and perhaps most important, sophisticated maintenance facilities capable of complete overhauls and able to forward supplies of spare parts to forward fields. Marshall may not have wanted a second England, but if there was to be war in the South Pacific, the United States and its allies were going to have to build small cities. Once these major complexes were in place, the use and seizure of forward combat bases could commence in earnest.